Typewriter. But why? It all started when Sarah stumbled upon a vintage typewriter listed on Facebook Marketplace. It was pristine, a beautiful Remington that looked like it had stories to tell. The seller, a man named Carl, had posted several photos and a reasonable price. After a few messages back and forth, they agreed to meet at an abandoned school just outside of town. Why would he want to meet there, Sarah thought. But the allure of the typewriter made her dismiss her unease. The school had been closed for years, its windows boarded up, but the eerie charm of the place intrigued her. She figured it was just a quirky choice. As she arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The wind whistled through the broken windows, giving the place a haunting atmosphere. Sarah felt a chill, but she brushed it off. She'd been excited about this deal for days. When she stepped inside the school, the air was heavy with dust and a strange mustiness. Her heart raced as she called out, "Carl?" Her voice echoed through the empty halls, but there was no response. The feeling of being watched crept over her as she moved deeper into the building. A sudden creaking noise startled her. She turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall man with disheveled hair and sunken eyes. "You're here for the typewriter?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes, I am," Sarah replied, forcing a smile despite her growing apprehension. "Follow me," he said, turning away without waiting for her response. Sarah hesitated, but the thought of leaving empty-handed urged her to follow him down a narrow hallway, lined with peeling paint and broken lockers. They reached a dusty classroom filled with abandoned desks. In the corner sat the typewriter, a beautiful machine that looked even better in person. "Here it is," Carl said, gesturing toward it. "Just needs a little cleaning." As she stepped closer, Sarah felt a sudden chill. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. "How about I just take a look at it first?" she suggested, trying to maintain her composure. "Sure," Carl said, but his tone shifted, darkening. "You know, I've had some trouble with other buyers before. People can be untrustworthy." Before Sarah could react, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. Panic surged through her as she realized she was trapped. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "Just making sure you're not a cop," he hissed, dragging her toward a door at the back of the classroom. Desperate, Sarah twisted and pulled away, but it was no use. Carl was stronger than he looked. As they burst through the door, she found herself in a dark cellar, the smell of damp earth filling the air. "Stop!" she screamed, but her voice echoed helplessly against the stone walls. He shoved her inside, slamming the door behind them. The sound of metal clanking sent her heart racing. He was locking her in. The room was pitch black, and Sarah could hear Carl moving around. She fumbled for her phone, praying for a signal. But there was nothing, just silence and her racing heartbeat. The darkness swallowed her fear, morphing it into something raw and primal. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. She could hear Carl muttering to himself, occasionally punctuated by the clinking of chains. She banged on the door, yelling for help, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. Suddenly, she heard a thud, followed by a strangled groan. Was Carl fighting with someone? The noise grew more frantic, and Sarah's heart raced. This could be her chance. But just as she gathered the courage to push against the door, it swung open, revealing Carl with a crazed look in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," he screamed, lunging at her. But behind him stood another man, larger and more menacing, a wild glint in his eyes. They collided, and for a moment, Sarah stood frozen in disbelief. But as the two men grappled, the larger one turned, and Sarah realized something was off. He didn't look like a savior. Instead, he looked at her with a predatory grin. The chaos intensified, and Sarah felt herself slipping into a nightmare, overwhelmed by a wave of hopelessness. In the struggle, the larger man knocked Carl aside, sending him sprawling to the ground. But before Sarah could react, the man grabbed her and pulled her closer. Just as she thought all hope was lost, the basement door burst open, and a flash of light filled the room. Several police officers flooded in, guns drawn. "Get on the ground!" they shouted, but it was too late. The larger man released her, scrambling toward the dark corner of the cellar. In the chaos, Sarah fell to the ground, sobbing with relief as the officers took control of the situation. Hours later, sitting in the back of a police car, she recounted her ordeal, still shaking. They assured her she was safe now. Carl was taken away in cuffs, but the larger man had vanished into the night. As the officers checked in, one of them turned to her. "We found some odd things in that cellar, old furniture, clothes, and a bunch of photos." "What kind of photos?" Sarah asked, her heart sinking. "People. Missing persons. Some of them look like you." A chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" "It's almost as if he was collecting them," the officer continued. "There was even one that looked just like you. Same clothes, same hair, only it was dated years ago." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. What did they mean? She was real. She had a life, friends, a job. But as the officers pulled out the photos, her blood ran cold. There she was, smiling, standing in front of a vintage typewriter, the same one Carl had tried to sell her. Only the date on the photo was from a time before she was even born. As the realization washed over her, the last threads of her existence began to unravel. She wasn't real. She was just a ghost haunting her own life, a figment in a twisted game played by someone who had been long forgotten. And in that moment, she understood. It wasn't Carl who had done this to her. It was herself, lost in the memories of a life she never truly lived, a shadow trapped in the darkness of an abandoned school.